He walked into the restaurant like any other customer, but walked out leaving an entire town changed forever. What happened inside those four walls didn't just make headlines. It made people rethink what it means to be heard without saying a word. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your support is the motivation that drives us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. It was the kind of roadside place that didn't look like much from the outside: chipped paint, faded sign, a crooked neon, open, flickering in the window. But everyone said they had the best barbecue in Cedar Hill. So, on his way out of town, J.D. Vance figured he'd stop in. Just a quick lunch, nothing more. He parked his rental under a sycamore tree, stepped out, and straightened his jacket. The fall wind carried a trace of hickory smoke. It smelled good, honest, like someone had been tending the pit since dawn. His stomach growled. Inside, the place was warm, a little dim, with old license plates nailed along the walls and framed newspaper clippings from 20 years ago. A few locals sat at scattered tables, heads bent over pulled pork sandwiches. A bell above the door had jingled when J.D. walked in. But no one looked up. He made his way to a small table by the window, took off his coat, and sat down. There were no menus, but he figured someone would come by soon enough. A few minutes passed. Then she approached, a waitress, maybe in her 30s, dark apron, hair pulled back tight. She didn't smile. "You're J.D. Vance, right?" Her voice was flat, not curious, not friendly. J.D. nodded, a little unsure. "That's right. Heard y'all have the best ribs in the county." The woman didn't respond. She just stood there for a beat, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressed into a line. Then, without a word, she turned and walked toward the kitchen. J.D. watched her go. Confused, he shifted in his chair. The smell of smoke and meat hung in the air, but something colder had settled too. Around him, whispers began. A man near the counter leaned toward his wife and muttered something. Another patron across the room raised his eyebrows, eyes flicking from J.D. to the kitchen door and back again. J.D. glanced around, trying to stay calm. He'd been in rooms like this before, places where you felt the temperature shift without anyone needing to say a word. From the open window to the kitchen, he spotted a young man, maybe 18, 19, wearing a black apron and a backward cap. He stood behind the prep counter, watching. His gaze wasn't hostile. If anything, it looked apologetic. But the boy didn't move. J.D. adjusted his seat, sat a little straighter. He didn't want to assume anything. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the waitress was having a bad day. Still, something in his gut told him this wasn't about slow service or a misplaced order. He looked toward the kitchen door again, waiting, but no one came back. He folded his hands on the table, took a slow breath, and tried to pretend he couldn't hear the hush that had fallen over the room. Out the window, a breeze rustled the red and orange leaves. Inside, everything was still. J.D. didn't stand up just yet. He waited a moment longer, as if the universe might change its mind. It didn't. J.D. sat still at the table, fingers gently tapping the wood grain as the voices around him softened to murmurs. The kitchen door swung open again. But this time, it wasn't the waitress returning. A man stepped out, mid-60s. Sturdy build, apron tied neatly around his waist. His sleeves were rolled up, arms dusted with flour and smoke. From the way people straightened in their seats, J.D. could tell this man wasn't just any cook. He was the owner. The man walked slowly toward J.D., a smile pressed onto his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're J.D. Vance, right?" he asked, voice calm but clipped. J.D. nodded, already bracing himself. "We've got a policy here," the man said, looking around as if his words weren't just for J.D. but for everyone listening. "We reserve the right to choose who we serve, and we don't serve those who promote division." He didn't yell, he didn't sneer. He said it like someone stating a house rule: no outside drinks, no political figures. The air in the room tightened. J.D. blinked, lips parting just slightly, not because he hadn't expected something like this, but because of the casual ease with which it was delivered. Like it was just another Tuesday and he'd simply ordered the wrong item off the menu. From the far side of the room, A woman's voice broke through. Soft, uncertain. Is that really necessary? Heads turned toward her. An older woman, cardigan wrapped tight, hands clasped in her lap. She didn't look at JD, just stared at the owner with a quiet weight behind her words. But the owner didn't respond. He didn't even glance her way. Around them, silence fractured. A young man near the window smirked and shook his head. Another customer leaned back, arms crossed, eyes sharp with agreement. Someone else, maybe a newcomer, looked uncomfortable, unsure of where to place their gaze. JD felt every stare. Some pitying, some proud, some blank. He took a slow breath, not trusting his voice. His eyes drifted past the man in front of him, toward the open kitchen where the smell of smoked ribs still hung thick in the air. It reminded him of childhood weekends, smoky backyards, hands sticky with sauce, the kind of food that felt like home. He looked up again. The owner was still standing there, waiting for him to say something. But JD didn't. He stood, calmly, carefully, slid his chair back without a sound. He gave a slight nod, not to the man, but to the room, his gaze sweeping across the tables like someone memorizing the faces of people who stayed silent. His eyes landed for a beat on the young line cook in the back. The one who hadn't said a word but looked like he might have wanted to. Then he turned toward the door. Outside, the wind had picked up. JD walked to his car, keys already in hand, but he didn't start the engine right away. He sat there for a while, watching the street. A mother walked by with her daughter, pointing toward a gift shop across the way. A delivery truck rumbled past. Life moved on, unaware. He opened his phone, thumb hovering over the screen. His heart still beat a little faster than normal. He opened the Notes app and typed, "I wasn't served today, but the place smelled like heaven, smoke, spice, memories." He paused, then added, "We don't have to agree. I still believe in supporting local businesses." He read it twice. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't weak. Just honest. He didn't post it, not yet. Instead, he saved the draft, set the phone down on the passenger seat, and gripped the steering wheel with both hands. Out of the corner of his eye, he could still see the outline of the restaurant in the mirror. He didn't look back again as he pulled onto the road. Back in his hotel room, JD shut the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, letting out a long breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The familiar stillness of the room offered a kind of comfort, but also an unsettling quiet. He walked over to the desk, set down his phone, and opened the laptop. The screen lit up, reflecting faintly on his face as he stared at the blinking cursor. The words didn't come right away. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way people expected someone to be after an incident like that. But there was something else beneath the surface. Not just the sting of public rejection, but the deeper ache of something more personal, more human. He'd been misunderstood before, mocked, labeled. That came with the territory. But this time, it didn't feel like politics. It felt like dignity being chipped away, right there in front of strangers who chose to watch instead of speak. He began typing, slowly, carefully. "I wasn't served lunch today. That's their right, no hard feelings." Then he paused, fingers hovering above the keys, mind spinning. He continued, "But I'll say this, whatever your views, the smell coming out of that kitchen was something special. That kind of flavor doesn't happen overnight. It comes from time, patience, and pride." He reread it, then added the final line. "We won't always agree. That's okay. I still believe in supporting small businesses, especially those built with care." He stared at it for a moment, then hit post. No hashtags, no photos, just words. The post went up quietly that evening. JD shut the laptop, stretched his arms, and sat back in the worn desk chair, staring at the muted light outside the window. In the distance, a semi rumbled down the highway, taillights fading into the night. Within an hour, the post began to spread. Some folks praised him, said he handled it with grace, called him an example of what civil discourse should look like. Others weren't so kind, said he was weak, that he should have stood up for himself, that letting them get away with it only proved their point. And then came the ones who claimed they'd been there. Locals, tourists. A man from 3 tables down said, "It didn't happen like that. He just sat there, real quiet, and then left." Another claimed, The owner didn't raise his voice. But it was clear what he meant. Small town newspapers picked up the story. The Cedar Hill Gazette ran a neutral piece titled, "Rights and Respect. A Town Reflects." The article asked a question that wasn't easily answered. When does a private right become a public wrong? By midweek, the conversation had stretched far beyond JD's post. Some called for boycotts. Others promised to drive in just to eat at the place. The owner, Bill Maddox, broke his silence on his personal page. Writing, "We stand by our principles. We serve with our hearts, not with fear. This is a place of trust, not a stage for political theater." The post racked up likes and heart emojis from locals. But the comments told a more complicated story. A young server named Tyler, who'd been quietly folding napkins in the back the day JD visited, noticed a shift in the air. New customers arrived, not with hunger, but with questions. Phones hovered, conversations lowered to whispers. Some asked, "Is this where it happened?" Others laughed, joked, or nodded as if checking something off a list. It wasn't the kind of crowd that came for food. Tyler mentioned it once to Bill. "They're not here for the ribs." Bill shrugged. "Doesn't matter. A full table is a full table." But Tyler knew better. The usual warmth had thinned. The regulars kept their heads down. The laughter came less often. Back in his car, somewhere outside the city, JD watched the storm from a distance. He didn't post again, didn't clarify, didn't defend. He had said his piece. But sometimes, silence echoes longer than words ever could. The post JD wrote had already made its quiet rounds. But by the following morning, it had grown legs of its own. Screens lit up across the country. Notifications buzzed. And shares climbed. Especially after a well-known columnist retweeted it with a caption that read, "This is what grace under fire looks like." Then came the video. It was short, just under 40 seconds, filmed by someone sitting diagonally across the room. The camera was a little shaky. The sound barely there, but the image was clear enough. JD was sitting calmly at the table, then nodding with a faint smile after the owner spoke to him. He stood, collected, offered a small thanks, and walked out without a word of protest. No anger, no raised voice, just a quiet dignity that landed harder than any shouting match could. The video spread faster than the original post. Some praised his composure, calling him a class act. Others called it calculated, but most agreed on one thing. It didn't look like someone playing politics. It looked like someone being human. The country, already tense with its own lines drawn in the sand, couldn't help but weigh in. One side insisted the restaurant had every right. Private business, private rules. The other side pushed back, arguing that when a place serves the public, it carries a higher duty. That overt discrimination, even under the guise of choice, still left a scar. Then came a local piece from a Cedar Hill reporter named Lana Brooks. She'd lived in the town for over 20 years. And her article didn't take sides. It simply laid out the facts. This wasn't the first time the restaurant had refused service based on perceived political leanings. But this was the first time the person on the receiving end didn't fight back. Instead, they thanked them and walked out. Her closing line read, "Maybe it's not what we say that sticks. Maybe it's how we leave the room." The effect was immediate. Loyal customers of the restaurant began to feel uncomfortable. Not outraged, just uncertain. They walked in, ordered their usual, but the room felt different. The servers noticed it first. Laughter didn't come as freely. Conversations quieted down when the door opened. Even regulars stopped making small talk. Tyler, the young cook, finally gave his 2 weeks' notice. "It's not about who's right or wrong," he told his manager. "It's just exhausting to be in here now. Feels like everyone's watching everyone else." Others followed. JD, meanwhile, stayed out of the fray. He didn't give interviews, didn't make follow-up posts, but the silence around him only made the story grow louder. One evening, as he sat reading in a small roadside diner miles from Cedar Hill, his phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. It read, "I used to work there. What happened to you?" "That happened to me too. But nobody believed me, nobody cared, until you walked out the way you did." The sender's name was Michelle Torres. JD remembered the name from an old blog post years ago. She'd written about being let go from a job in Cedar Hill under strange circumstances. At the time, it had barely made a ripple. But now, it was being recirculated, reshared, reframed. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, Bill Maddox, owner, pitmaster, proud of his family recipe, noticed something he couldn't quite explain. Customers still came, yes, but their eyes held something different. Less warmth, more curiosity, like they were there not just for the food, but to witness something, maybe even to challenge it. One woman asked him directly, "Do you regret it?" He waved her off with a half smile and a shrug. "I don't answer to the internet." But later that night, in the stillness of the closed kitchen, he sat alone, elbows on the prep table, reading something on his phone. JD's post. Again. And then he did something he hadn't planned. He typed a message. "I didn't think it would get this far. I won't say sorry, but I'll admit, I'm confused by how this all turned out." Another pause. "If you're ever back this way, come by. You should at least try the ribs." JD stared at the message when it arrived. He didn't reply. Not yet. He simply leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling, thoughts churning in the quiet. The message from Bill Maddox sat on JD's phone for the better part of the morning. He had read it once, then again, and again. There was no apology in it, no backpedaling, but there was something else, an unexpected quietness, maybe even a hesitation, that hadn't been there before. JD didn't respond, not immediately. He spent the next few hours doing nothing in particular, shuffling through emails, making notes for an upcoming meeting, half listening to the hotel newsfeed humming in the background. But his thoughts kept drifting back to that message, not because it was offensive, not because it was kind, but because it felt unsettled, like a man trying to figure out which part of the storm he'd walked into. And JD wasn't looking for retribution. He never had been. The idea of going back to that small-town barbecue joint didn't appeal to his pride. But then he remembered what Michelle had written to him. "You made people feel ashamed of how quiet they've been." That line, it stuck with him. It wasn't about the meat, or the chairs, or the words spoken. It was about what people didn't say, about what they were willing to overlook. By the end of the day, he'd made up his mind. He'd go back. No announcement, no social media hints, no camera crew or journalists. Just a quiet drive into Cedar Hill. No different than before, like slipping into a place that hadn't decided if it wanted to remember you or forget you altogether. He parked in the same spot as last time, across from the diner. The street was still, the wind pushing dry leaves across the pavement like they had somewhere to be. JD stepped out of the car, ran a hand across his jaw, and headed toward the door. Inside, the place was nearly empty. A few tables were occupied, mostly older locals, their eyes trained on plates or phones, pretending not to notice the man who just walked in. The smell of smoked oak and slow-roasted brisket clung to the air. It hadn't changed. A young woman behind the counter looked up. She was new. JD hadn't seen her last time. She blinked, froze for half a second, then offered a small nod. "You can sit wherever you like," she said. JD chose a table near the window. The same spot, though he didn't plan it that way. He sat quietly, resting his hands on the table, letting the silence stretch. Then Bill appeared, not with a grand entrance. No dramatic gestures. Just a man walking out from the kitchen with a white apron stained from a morning's work. His eyes met JD's, and for a brief moment, both men stood in the weight of that recognition. "No cameras this time?" Bill asked, the corner of his mouth tugging slightly. "No," JD replied, evenly. "Didn't bring a press pass either." Bill exhaled through his nose, walked over slowly. "Brisket's the same. Haven't changed the recipe just because the internet had an opinion." JD offered a faint smile. "Good to know." He ordered the brisket plate with slaw and cornbread. When it arrived, it looked and smelled exactly like the stories people told. Tender, charred just right, steaming under a glaze of tangy sauce. He ate in silence. No one approached him, no one interrupted, but he felt it, quiet glances, cautious acknowledgments. A man at the next table gave him a subtle nod. Another, further back, lifted a hand in a casual wave. No one spoke, but the room felt different from before, like the volume had been turned down, but the meaning dialed up. When the meal was finished, JD reached for his wallet, laying a couple of bills on the table. But before he could stand, Bill returned. "That won't be necessary," he said. JD looked up. "Call it a thank you." Bill added, "Not for the publicity. Lord knows I didn't want that. But for not lighting a match when you had every right to." There was no smile between them. Just a moment of understanding. Maybe not even forgiveness, just space. Honest, unfiltered space. JD rose from his chair, picked up his coat, and turned toward the door. Before stepping out, he glanced over his shoulder. "Next time," he said, "I hope I won't need to be someone special just to be served." Then he left, the bell above the door jingling behind him, and the scent of barbecue trailing him out onto the sidewalk like a memory you can't quite shake. For a moment, it felt like everything had settled. JD had returned, eaten his meal in peace, and walked out without a single word about what had happened before. No statement, no applause, just the quiet dignity of someone who knew when to speak and when not to. But silence, when sincere, has a strange way of echoing louder than any speech. 2 days after his return to Cedar Hill, a Facebook post started gaining traction. It was written by a local resident, no blue checkmark, no media background, just someone who'd been there. Twice. "I was there the day he was turned away." The post read, "And I was there when he came back. He didn't talk about what happened. He didn't look around for cameras or speak to anyone about justice or revenge. He just sat down and ate. I watched him, and I felt ashamed for how silent I had been the first time." The post didn't go viral in the usual sense. It didn't spark a firestorm. But it moved, quietly, consistently, across timelines, group chats, and family dinners. People began adding their own moments beneath the original post. Stories poured in, small, painfully familiar instances of unfairness. People remembering the time they watched someone get talked down to and said nothing. A kid on a playground, a clerk at a grocery store, a coworker in a break room. They hadn't stood up, but now, reading that post, they started to wonder why. A larger media outlet eventually picked up the thread and reached out to JD. They asked for an interview, expecting a statement, maybe even a campaign, but JD declined most of their questions. He offered one line, "I think kindness doesn't need to shout." Those 6 words ended up on the front page. Meanwhile, things began to shift back in Cedar Hill. The barbecue joint, once the center of attention for its defiance, now found itself at the center of a different kind of attention. Bill Maddox, the owner, started receiving letters, some handwritten, some emailed, from customers who used to visit every Sunday after church or every Friday after work. Most weren't angry, they weren't accusatory, they were reflective. One note read, "We miss your food, but more than that, we miss what your place used to mean, a place where folks could sit together, even if they didn't see eye to eye." Another said, "You don't have to agree with every customer, but you can still feed them with respect." Among those letters came one from Daniel Rivera, a former line cook who'd quietly disappeared from the roster the year before. Daniel had been let go, unofficially, after a quiet disagreement with Bill about how the place treated certain customers. He had never made a scene, never gone public, just walked away. Now, he had written back, "I don't need to come back." The note said, "I just needed to know you saw what I saw. That's enough for me." Bill didn't respond to the letters, not directly, but he made a few changes. The "We reserve the right to refuse service" sign, long taped near the front register, disappeared. The employees were told they didn't need to comment on customers' identities or views. Just serve the food, make it good, make it fair. Outside the diner, the town of Cedar Hill felt different. The debates didn't stop. People still had opinions, still disagreed over politics, policy, identity, but something in the air had changed. Conversations, once full of heat, started including pauses, listening, acknowledgement. JD didn't return to the diner again. He didn't need to. He didn't give a closing statement or turn the moment into a book tour. He just stayed quiet, letting the story belong to the people who'd witnessed it. At the local high school, one of the English teachers assigned an open-topic essay to her senior class. Students could write about anything that mattered to them, anything that made them think. One student, Anna Chambers, turned in her piece early. It was titled, "When a Man Was Denied a Meal." He taught a town how to be kind. It ended with this line: "Sometimes, the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all." The story of JD and the barbecue joint in Cedar Hill had moved beyond local curiosity. It had become something else entirely, a mirror. And mirrors, by nature, don't lie, they don't scream, they don't preach, they just reflect. Major news outlets began circling the quiet town like birds sensing an uncommon stillness. Headlines no longer used words like outrage or boycott. Instead, they leaned into phrases like, "a different kind of courage," and "the power of restraint." Among the voices that once dismissed JD's values stood a name familiar to many viewers: Rachel Langley. A sharp, charismatic news anchor who had, not long ago, accused JD of playing both sides to stay likable. Now, she reached out not to debate, but to listen. "I used to think stories needed conflict to matter," she said on her morning show. "But sometimes, it's the absence of conflict that leaves us asking the biggest questions." She requested a one-on-one exclusive. National TV, prime slot. JD declined. Instead, he offered her a single answer via email. "I don't believe I did anything heroic." The email read, "I just tried not to make a hard situation worse." Rachel read it on air, slowly, and then she paused, a long, intentional silence that made every viewer lean in. No spin, no follow-up, just the echo of a sentence that refused to inflate itself. Back in Cedar Hill, however, the calm was deceptive. The scrutiny now pointed at Bill Maddox, the owner of the barbecue joint. Reporters began digging: old reviews, archived social media posts, neighborhood chatter. And it turned out, JD wasn't the first. 3 other patrons had quietly walked away in the past 18 months, each one known in town for holding opinions that didn't fit the mold. None of them had gone public. None had been filmed. And none had JD's ability to make the silence speak. One of them, a school counselor, agreed to talk anonymously. "I figured, that's just how it is here," she said, "until I saw how JD handled it. That's when I realized it didn't have to be." Bill found himself at the center of something he didn't recognize. For years, he'd seen himself as a protector of local values. He believed his actions were about preserving something pure, something traditional. But now, that tradition looked less like pride and more like exclusion. A small group of his loyal customers decided to hold a rally: freedom to choose who you serve. They called it folding chairs, lemonade coolers, a few cardboard signs that read, "Private business, private rules." But across the park, uninvited and unscripted, a group of teenagers showed up. Not yelling, not arguing, just standing, holding hand-painted signs. "Kindness is louder." A local news station covered the moment. The image of one older man folding his arms while a 17-year-old girl quietly held her sign in front of him made the evening broadcast. Inside the diner, staff noticed changes too. Not in volume, customers still came. But the tone had shifted. Conversations were shorter. Smiles felt rehearsed. When a local journalist asked Lisa, one of the younger servers, how things were going, she didn't dodge the question. "We didn't learn anything from turning someone away," she said, "but we learned a lot from how he walked out." That quote spread faster than most editorials. It landed on message boards, underlined in group chats, and even printed in bold letters in the high school newsletter. Back at home, JD stayed quiet. He didn't repost, didn't share. He watched everything unfold the way someone might watch snow falling from inside a warm cabin, aware of the beauty, humbled by the quiet weight of it. And in town, people began talking differently, not about politics, necessarily, but about tone, about empathy, about what it really means to disagree without demeaning. Bill Maddox stood behind his counter every morning, pouring coffee for folks he'd known for decades. And yet, for the first time in a long while, he couldn't tell what they were thinking. He missed the certainty, but a part of him suspected this uncertainty was where growth actually began. No apology had been offered, no peace treaty signed, but something had shifted, and for once, that was enough. By the time summer rolled into Cedar Hill, the town had become something it never set out to be: an example. Not of outrage, not of protest, not even of resolution, but of restraint, of quiet strength, of what happens when someone chooses to step back instead of lashing out. The story of JD's silent meal, and the louder silence before it had traveled far. National conversations had faded, but local ones kept blooming. Schools, churches, libraries, even barbershops had begun using the moment as a reference point. Not to take sides, but to ask questions. An education nonprofit reached out to JD, inviting him to speak at their annual summit on civility and courage in a divided time. The theme had been decided months earlier, long before Cedar Hill meant anything outside of Missouri. They hoped his presence would be symbolic. JD declined the podium, but he sent a short voice message to be played during the event. "I don't think people need to be heroes," his voice said, calm and steady. "Sometimes, it's enough just not to be the person who makes things worse." The clip lasted under a minute, but in that quiet conference hall, it felt like a sermon. Back in Cedar Hill, Bill Maddox wasn't looking for sermons. He was just trying to run a diner again. There were no grand announcements, no printed statements, no apologies nailed to the front door. But things started changing, subtle things. The menu got longer, new items, more options, fewer questions asked. When he hired new staff, he didn't ask what church they went to, or who they voted for, just if they could handle a dinner rush, and if they could smile even when the grill was backed up. A local folk duo began playing Friday nights by the window. They weren't loud, just enough to hum under the clink of forks and the low chatter of neighbors relearning how to talk across differences. The tension that had once lived in the corners of the dining room slowly faded. It didn't vanish, but it made room for something else: awkward laughs, cautious nods, and over time, even eye contact. In a second-grade classroom 2 blocks away, Mrs. Holloway, the schoolteacher with a reputation for weaving life lessons into grammar drills, introduced something new. She called it the empty chair. It was a simple wooden seat, tucked into the corner by the reading rug. Every time someone interrupted or dismissed a classmate's opinion, she'd quietly walk over, rest her hand on the chair, and say, "Let's remember who we're not listening to." The kids didn't need the full story. They just needed the symbol. One day, a visitor snapped a photo through the front window of Maddox's diner. It showed a small corner table by the glass, a single chair facing outward, sunlight spilling over the seat. No one sat there, but taped to the wall just above it, handwritten on plain paper, was a line: "You don't need to shout to be heard." The photo spread quickly, finding its way into articles, slideshows, even printed onto mugs in a neighboring town's gift shop. JD never reposted it. He never commented, but he saw it, and he smiled. Late one evening, his inbox dinged with a new message. The sender was unfamiliar. Her name was Naomi. She lived 2 states over. In Kentucky, she wrote plainly. "I was turned away too." The message read, not as politely, not as quietly, "I didn't speak up because I didn't think anyone would care." There was a pause before her final line. "But then I saw what you did. And now, I think I'm ready to walk through the door again. My way. No fanfare, no hashtags, just a ripple, just one more chair, pulled back out from the wall." The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It came on state letterhead, folded neatly in a plain white envelope. No special seal or urgency label, just one more piece of mail in a stack that had grown increasingly nerve-wracking to open. The Missouri State Human Rights Commission had announced a special session. A hearing, not a trial, they were careful to say. Not an inquisition, just a conversation, open to the public, about the rising number of cases where service had been denied not because of race, gender, or religion, but because of opinion. At the top of the agenda, Cedar Hill. The name of the town printed on the announcement hit differently than it used to. It used to conjure comfort, predictability, maybe even pride. Now, for many, it stirred something else: conflict, reflection, discomfort. JD received his invitation the same day. He read it once, quietly, while sitting on a park bench in Columbus. Far from the headlines, far from the heat of it all. He didn't hesitate. He didn't draft 3 versions of a response or call anyone for advice. He just wrote, "I don't need to see anyone punished. I need to see a community that can grow. That's all I ever wanted." And he sent it. No interview, no media blast, just truth, measured and firm, delivered the way he always had, with restraint. Meanwhile, back in Cedar Hill, Bill Maddox stared at his own letter with more reluctance. He placed it on the counter, then moved it to the kitchen, then tucked it behind the cash register. Every time he saw it, something twisted in his chest. Not guilt exactly, but something nearby. Something raw. His initial instinct had been clear: he wouldn't go. What good could come of it? Letting politicians and strangers dissect his choices, his business, his past. But the silence wasn't holding. Local press had picked up the hearing announcement. Articles resurfaced old testimonies. A quiet customer from 2 years ago. A single mother turned away one weekend after a town hall meeting. A delivery driver told to get his ideas straight before ordering. They weren't angry stories, not sensational, just matter of fact, just quiet voices that had never been heard until now. A call came from Greg Swanson, an old friend and fellow restaurant owner. They hadn't spoken since before the JD incident. Their conversation was stiff at first, but Greg cut to the point. "I've had 3 vendors back out," Greg said, his tone flat. "Didn't blame me, just said they didn't want to get pulled into anything tied to the Cedar Hill situation." Bill didn't answer. He didn't need to. "You might think this is about you, Bill," Greg added, softer now, "but it's about trust, and the town's not sure who you are anymore." That night, Bill sat at the kitchen table, thumbing through old receipts, skimming reservations, looking for something. He wasn't even sure what. Then he remembered Marcy. It was 2 summers back. She had walked in with her teenage son, still wearing their volunteer shirts from a local rally. He hadn't liked their tone, thought they were smug, so when they asked for a table, he told them it was booked up. It wasn't. He just decided they didn't belong there. He told himself it wasn't personal. But now, thinking back, he couldn't remember what they'd said. He only remembered how he'd felt. The next morning, Maddox's cook, Julia, came in early. Her apron was folded under her arm, but she didn't tie it on. Instead, she placed a folded note on the prep counter and turned to him. "I'm done, Bill," she said quietly. "Is this about—" "No," she interrupted. "It's about who you were, and who you could be again. That's what this place used to mean." He nodded, not trying to stop her. When she left, he unfolded the note. In her clean, looping script, it read, "You used to be a good man. I think you just forgot for a little while." That line sat with him all day. Through lunch, through the slow afternoon hum, through the moment his wife, Diane, placed a plate in front of him without a word. They didn't talk for a long time. But as she was loading the dishwasher, she glanced back at him. "If you're waiting for someone else to say they're sorry first," she said, "you might be waiting forever." Later that night, he took the letter back out. He didn't rehearse. He didn't scribble a draft. He just picked up a pen and wrote, "To whom it may concern, I will attend the hearing. Not to defend myself, just to listen. Sincerely, William Maddox." And he mailed it the next morning, quietly, while the town was still waking up. The town hall looked different that morning, brighter somehow, though the clouds hung low and the air carried that heavy, waiting quiet that comes before a storm. Folding chairs lined the room in neat, expectant rows, filled with reporters, locals, and a few faces who had traveled in from other counties just to see it all unfold. At the front, a small table had been placed between 2 flags, beside a podium with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Missouri Human Rights Commission, Special Hearing." One chair was left empty. It had a simple nameplate taped to the back, J.D. Vance. No one sat there, no one touched it. The seat remained unclaimed, quietly present in a room brimming with voices. The hearing began right on time. A soft-spoken councilwoman stood to open the session, her glasses slipping down her nose as she unfolded a piece of paper. "We invited Mr. Vance to be here today," she said, her voice calm, clear, and while he chose not to attend in person, he did send a brief written statement. She paused, letting the hush settle again. "I am not here to accuse anyone. I've been heard in ways I never expected, and that's enough for me. J.D. Vance." A ripple moved through the room, some nodding, some unsure what to make of such a simple answer. Then, all eyes turned as William Maddox, the owner of the restaurant at the heart of it all, stood slowly from his seat near the aisle. No lawyer walked beside him, no notes in hand, just him, tie loose, face drawn, shoulders a little heavier than they once were. He approached the podium, adjusted the mic once, then turned to glance at the empty chair. For a second, he looked like he might speak directly to it. I used to think trust was about picking the right side. He began, his voice low, steady, about protecting what you built, even if it meant keeping certain people out. But I've come to believe it's more about how willing you are to listen, especially to the folks you don't agree with. A few heads turned toward one another. A woman in the third row, the same one who once left a glowing review on the restaurant's Facebook page, dabbed at her eye with a tissue. I don't have a speech. He continued. I don't have a list of excuses or a PR person telling me how to say things the right way. I've got a place I love, in a town I care about. And I heard it, not with a shout, but with a choice. The room held its breath. I didn't break a law. I didn't scream or shove or threaten. I just told a man he wasn't welcome. That should have been quiet, small, forgettable, but it wasn't. He looked down at his hands. Then back up. I didn't come here to beg forgiveness. I came because I needed to be the one to say it. Out loud. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just silence, and the weight of words finding their place in the air. After the official session closed, a local reporter approached him near the coat rack, recorder in hand, press badge swinging at her chest. Mr. Maddox, if you had the chance to speak directly to JD, what would you say to him now? He looked past her, toward the double doors leading out to the sidewalk, where sunlight was just beginning to break through the gray. I wouldn't offer him a free meal, he said quietly. I'd offer him a table, same as anyone else. That was all. He picked up his coat and walked out without fanfare. Later that night, as stories went to print and news segments aired across the state, one image stood out more than any quote or headline. It was a photograph taken by a college student sitting in the back row, a simple frame capturing the front of the room. The flags, the podium, and the empty chair marked with JD's name. No one had touched it. The caption ran on the front page of the state's most read morning paper. The power of one man lies not in what he says, but in knowing when not to speak. And in that stillness, Cedar Hill found something it hadn't known it was looking for. Not victory, not vindication, just a moment of quiet, filled with change. After the hearing, Cedar Hill didn't return to the quiet little town it once was, but something in the air had shifted. It wasn't silence anymore, it was space. Space for people to speak, to listen, and maybe even to disagree without turning their backs. At the high school, a group of students launched a campaign they called No Border Roundtables. It started with one idea: every cafe, diner, and restaurant in town would set aside a single empty chair in their dining area, not reserved, not labeled with a name, just quietly present, a symbol, a reminder that disagreement didn't have to mean division. That a seat at the table should never be conditional. They handed out flyers with simple hand-drawn sketches of tables and chairs. Nothing flashy, just a line scrawled across the bottom. There's always room for one more if you're willing to listen. Even Maddox's place, still just called The Grill. No rebranding, joined in. No big announcement, no social media post, just a wooden chair in the far left corner of the dining room, tucked beside the window, and above it, a white frame with a hand-lettered message that read, "Used to be a place that turned people away. Now it's where we're learning to listen." The regulars noticed, of course. Some nodded quietly the first time they saw it. Others didn't say much at all. But they kept coming back. And that said enough. JD stayed quiet through all of it. No more interviews. No op-eds. Just work, meetings, the occasional early morning jog. A colleague stopped him in the hallway one afternoon, waving a copy of a national magazine with JD's name on the cover. "You could ride this all the way to a book deal," the guy said, only half joking. "You sure you want to let it go?" JD gave a small shrug and a tired smile. "If someone out there changes because of what I did," he said, "then it's not about me anymore. That's the best case scenario." The colleague blinked, then folded the magazine in half and walked away. Back in Cedar Hill, Maddox kept showing up to work early, the way he always had. He didn't speak much about the hearing, and he never framed the newspaper clipping with his quote. But folks saw the difference. He greeted customers a little longer at the counter, held doors a little more often, and when someone brought up the incident, He didn't shut them down. He just listened. A regional paper ran a piece weeks later, long after the news vans had packed up and left. It wasn't flashy, just a quiet column buried on page 5 under the title, "Learning to Sit Together." No one came out of this a winner. It read, "But in a town where one man chose silence over spectacle, a whole lot of people found their voice." The story might have ended there, drifting into memory like most things do. But change, real change, doesn't always need headlines. Sometimes it lives in the smallest corners. Like a 5th grade classroom on a Thursday morning, where a girl named Eliza sat at her desk, chewing her pencil and staring at the top of her writing assignment. The prompt was simple. What would you change if you could change one thing in your town? Her paper began with uneven lines and awkward spelling. But the message was clear. I don't really get politics. But if someone gets kicked out of a restaurant just because they think different, then maybe one day it could happen to me. And I don't want that. Her teacher read it twice, then pinned it up on the wall, right above the coat rack. No one needed to say anything more. It was a quiet spring morning. The kind that slipped into the world without asking permission. No headlines. No soundtracks. Just the soft hush of wind through the trees and the hum of tires on old pavement. JD hadn't planned on stopping in Cedar Hill. He hadn't even said it out loud to himself. But as the town sign appeared in his windshield, he eased off the gas and took the exit. He didn't drive all the way in. Just parked a little ways up the hill, where you could see the street that ran past the diner. From there, the place looked just like it always had. Same brick, same front windows catching the morning light. The sign still said, "The Grill." No slogans, no banners. It didn't need them. He stood beside his car, hands in his pockets, watching. A family crossed the street, mom with a toddler on her hip, dad holding a to-go cup. A pair of teenagers on skateboards rolled by. Then a kid on a bike with a backpack too big for his frame. Through the window of the diner, JD caught sight of a young man, late teens, maybe early 20s, sitting at the table in the far corner by the window. The chair, the one that, for a while, had said something loud without ever speaking. The young man didn't seem to notice anything unusual about it. He ordered brisket, JD's old go-to, and scrolled his phone while waiting. No ceremony, no tribute, just part of the rhythm of the town now. JD smiled faintly, more to himself than anything else. He didn't cross the street, didn't step inside. Just turned, got back into the car, and drove away without anyone knowing he'd been there. That same afternoon, in a different state, a local news station ran a short piece about a small town incident. Another person turned away at a local diner. No raised voices, no protests, just a calm nod, a quiet exit, and a social media post that ended with a familiar line. I don't need an apology. I just need to believe that tomorrow, someone else won't be treated the way I was today. It started gaining traction, not because it was angry, but because it wasn't. People recognized the words, shared them again, this time, not tied to a face, but to an idea. Back in Cedar Hill, the chair in the corner remained. Some days it sat empty. Other days, someone took the seat without knowing, or maybe they did. It didn't matter. What mattered was that no one was turned away. At the elementary school, a 3rd grade teacher had written a sentence prompt on the chalkboard. The kids were to finish it with their own words. It read, "Name one small action that could change the world." One boy, sitting in the second row, tapped his pencil for a moment, then wrote in big uneven letters, "Don't yell, don't fight, just walk away, and let them see themselves." He paused, looked at what he wrote, and nodded like he understood something even if he couldn't say it yet. Sometimes, it doesn't take a movement. Sometimes, it doesn't even take a speech. Sometimes, the loudest change comes in silence, in the seat someone didn't take, in the words someone chose not to say, in the space they left behind for others to fill with something better. Not a declaration, not a victory, just a beginning. Sometimes, the quietest acts speak the loudest truths. JD didn't fight back with anger, didn't argue, didn't demand an apology. He simply walked away with dignity and let the world reflect on itself. So here's a question for you. In a world full of noise and division, what does real strength look like to you? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you even just a little, make sure to subscribe to Shadow Secrets for more powerful true stories that reveal the quiet strength behind extraordinary moments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.